Something unprecedented is happening in the skies over Tel Aviv, and the tactical data from the night of March 18th requires precise examination. An elderly couple in Ramat Gan, Yaron and Ilana Moshe, both in their 70s, heard the air raid siren and began moving toward their apartment's safe room. They made it within meters of the reinforced door before an Iranian ballistic missile released its payload overhead. They never made it inside. What killed them was not the main missile. Israeli air defenses had intercepted that. What killed them were submunitions from a cluster warhead, small bombs dispersed across an 8-mile radius after the main missile was already destroyed. And this is the element of Iran's response that is fundamentally changing the defensive calculus of this conflict. Subscribe to Pivot Analysis right now and turn on notifications. What is being documented here is a shift in missile warfare happening in real time, and the tactical implications require the kind of analysis that examines the actual weapon systems rather than simply repeating official assessments. When the next wave launches, when the next operational disclosure emerges, the analysis will be here. Before going further, it is necessary to establish clearly what is confirmed and what remains in the analytical category. The Khorramshahr 4 ballistic missile, also known as the K-bar, represents Iran's most advanced domestically produced medium-range strike system. What makes this weapon distinct is not just its 2,000-kilometer range or its 1,800-kilogram warhead capacity. It is the multi-target engagement capability. A single Khorramshahr 4 missile can release submunitions capable of striking up to 80 separate impact points once the delivery vehicle reaches the terminal engagement zone. Most Iranian ballistic missiles carry approximately 24 bomblets. The Khorramshahr 4 carries more than 3 times that number. And approximately 50% of all ballistic missiles Iran has fired at Israel since February 28th have carried cluster warheads. This is not a minor tactical adjustment. This is a fundamental reconfiguration of how Iran is prosecuting offensive missile operations against a defended target. What is confirmed? Iran began deploying cluster munition warheads systematically from the opening days of the conflict. The Israeli Defense Forces confirmed that by day 10 of the war, Iran had fired 300 missiles at Israel, and approximately half carried cluster submunitions. CNN obtained video footage showing the mid-air release of cluster bomblets from an Iranian missile on March 18th. Even after Israeli air defense intercepted the main delivery vehicle, the submunitions continued to disperse and fall. This is a critical operational detail. The bomblets do not require the main missile to survive interception in order to reach the target area. Once released, they function independently. The human cost has been documented in precise detail. On March 1st, a cluster munition struck a residential neighborhood in Beit Shemesh, 18 miles from Jerusalem, hitting a shelter inside a synagogue. 9 Israeli civilians were killed in what became the single deadliest strike of the conflict. On March 9th, 2 construction workers in Yehud, just outside Tel Aviv, were killed by submunitions while working outdoors. They were not in a protected shelter. The first victim died immediately. The second succumbed the following day. On the night of March 18th into the early morning hours, Iran launched 4 separate missile barrages within an 8-hour window. The attack that killed Yaron and Ilana Moshe in Ramat Gan involved a Khorramshahr 4 missile carrying a cluster warhead. Police spokesman Dean Elsdoon confirmed that the impact site showed evidence of cluster munitions. The couple was found meters from their safe room, alongside a walker. They heard the siren. They began moving. They did not have enough time. Tel Aviv District Police Commander Chaim Sargaroff stated that apparently they did not manage to reach the protected space. That same barrage struck 8 separate impact points across the Tel Aviv district, including damage to platforms at the Salvador Central train station that forced a nationwide suspension of rail services. On March 19th, a Thai agricultural worker named Chaiwat Wivneel, age 30, was killed at Moshav Adanim in central Israel when cluster munitions from another Iranian missile struck the area where he was working. The tactical data reveals a pattern. Iran is not firing cluster munitions at military infrastructure. Iran is firing them at residential areas, commercial zones, transportation hubs, areas characterized by high population density. The Arms Control Association's executive director stated directly that Iran appears to be launching cluster munitions into relatively populated areas, probably with the goal of producing potential civilian harm. Munitions expert N.R. Jensen Jones of Armament Research Services told CNN that this type of warhead is being deployed primarily to sow terror amongst a civilian population. The geographic distribution reinforces that assessment. Of the 281 Iranian attack waves documented by March 19th, 111 targeted the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. That represents 39.5% of all attacks concentrated on the most densely populated region of Israel. The cluster warhead is not a precision instrument. It is an area saturation weapon. When deployed over Tel Aviv, it disperses bomblets across a radius that can exceed 10 kilometers. Each bomblet carries up to 11 pounds of explosives. They fall indiscriminately on homes, businesses, roads, parks, construction sites. To understand why defense planners treat this weapon system with the seriousness they do, the mechanics of interception matter. Israel operates a multi-layered missile defense architecture. Arrow intercepts long-range ballistic missiles at high altitude and exo-atmospheric ranges. David's Sling targets medium-range missiles and drones. Iron Dome handles short-range rockets. This layered structure is designed to provide redundant coverage. But cluster munitions create a specific problem. The submunitions are small, they fall at high speeds, and the time window for interception after release is extremely limited. Israeli missile expert Tal Inbar, who consults for Israeli defense companies, explained that Iron Dome can intercept the bomblets, but such intercept attempts are not always successful. The bomblets can be released at high altitude to minimize the chance of successful ground-based interception. And even when the main missile is intercepted by Arrow or David's Sling before reaching Israeli airspace, the cluster warhead can still deploy if the missile was not hit head-on or if the bomblets were already released before interception occurred. This was documented on March 18th. CNN footage showed an Iranian missile intercepted overhead, followed immediately by the visible dispersal of cluster submunitions that continued falling despite the main vehicle being destroyed. The operational effect of this system lies in how it multiplies the defensive burden. A single incoming ballistic missile traditionally required 1 or 2 interceptors to neutralize. A cluster munition carrying 80 submunitions forces the defensive system to track and potentially intercept dozens of individual targets dispersed across a wide geographic area. Israel's Iron Dome has a stated interception rate above 90% under optimal conditions, but optimal conditions assume targets that follow predictable trajectories and arrive in manageable quantities. When 80 bomblets disperse simultaneously across an 8-mile radius, each following a slightly different ballistic path, the calculus changes. The defensive system must allocate interceptors to each track that poses a threat to populated areas. Each interceptor costs tens of thousands of dollars. Each bomblet costs a fraction of that amount. The economic asymmetry favors the attacker. And there is a finite number of interceptors available. Reports emerged in mid-March that Jerusalem was running low on air defense munitions. Experts noted that modern wars inevitably drain stockpiles, and that Israel likely planned for this scenario. But planning for interceptor depletion and experiencing it under sustained bombardment are distinct realities. Iran's strategic logic here is worth examining precisely because it represents a calculated adaptation to a defended environment. Iran does not possess the capability at present to orchestrate the kind of large-scale ballistic missile barrages it launched in previous conflicts with Israel. U.S. and Israeli airstrikes have destroyed hundreds of Iranian missile launchers. The number of daily ballistic missile launches by Iran declined 86 to 90% from the opening phase of the war to mid-March, as launchers and launch infrastructure were systematically targeted. IDF Chief of Staff Major General Eyal Zamir stated on March 5th that Israeli forces had rendered more than 300 ballistic missile launchers inoperable since February 28th and had destroyed around 80% of Iran's air defense systems. What Iran has done in response is shift from quantity to lethality per missile. If you cannot fire 100 missiles, you make each missile carry a payload that produces the destructive and psychological effect of multiple strikes. The cluster warhead achieves that. A single Khorramshahr, 4 with 80 submunitions, can strike targets across a geographic area that would traditionally require dozens of separate missiles to saturate, and it forces the defender to expend interceptors at a rate that accelerates stockpile depletion. The broader question that every analyst following this conflict is wrestling with is whether current air defense architectures can sustain effectiveness against adversaries willing to deploy submunition warheads at scale. Israel's missile defense is among the most sophisticated and extensively tested in the world. If Iron Dome and Arrow are struggling to intercept every bomblet from a cluster warhead, what does that imply for less robust defensive systems? The Pentagon has been observing the performance of Israeli air defenses closely because the same challenge applies to U.S. forward bases in the Gulf that are within range of Iranian missiles. Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates was reportedly struck by a Khorramshahr 4 inches early March. Satellite imagery showed a large crater at the base where aircraft shelters housing MQ-9 Reaper and MQ-4C Triton drones are located. If Iran is deploying cluster warheads against static military infrastructure, the defensive problem becomes exponentially more complex. You cannot evacuate an airbase or a command center the way you can evacuate civilians to shelters. The infrastructure must absorb the impact, or the defensive system must intercept every submunition before it reaches the target. The latter is not operationally feasible when 80 bomblets are falling simultaneously. To be fair, there is a counterargument, and it deserves serious consideration. Some analysts have suggested that cluster munitions represent a sign of Iranian desperation rather than strategic sophistication. The logic runs as follows. Iran is running low on conventional ballistic missiles because U.S. and Israeli strikes have destroyed production facilities and launch infrastructure. The cluster warhead allows Iran to stretch its remaining missile inventory by making each launch count for more. This is a tactical adaptation born of necessity rather than a deliberate, long-term strategy. Those are credible points, but the evidence from the battlefield does not fully support the desperation thesis. The targeting pattern is too consistent. The geographic focus on high-density civilian areas is too deliberate. If this were simply about maximizing damage with limited resources, you would expect to see more targeting of military infrastructure, logistics hubs, airfields. Instead, Iran is systematically saturating residential neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, Holon, Petah Tikva. That is a choice. It is a choice designed to impose psychological costs on the Israeli civilian population that exceed the material damage of the strikes themselves. When an elderly couple dies meters from their safe room because they did not have the 90 seconds required to reach it, the message being sent is that no space is truly safe. The siren gives you warning, but warning without sufficient time to act is functionally equivalent to no warning at all. Here is what to watch in the days ahead. The rate at which Iran can sustain cluster munition launches will indicate whether this tactic is a stopgap or a permanent feature of its missile doctrine. If Iran continues deploying cluster warheads at the current pace of approximately 50% of all launches, that suggests it has either stockpiled these systems in significant numbers or retained the industrial capacity to produce them despite ongoing airstrikes. The second variable to monitor is how Israel adjusts its interception doctrine. There are reports that Iron Dome is being instructed to prioritize interception of bomblets heading toward populated areas while allowing those falling in open terrain to impact without engagement. That is a rational allocation of limited interceptor inventory, but it also means accepting that some percentage of submunitions will reach the ground. The third factor is whether other actors in the region begin adopting similar tactics. Hezbollah has fired over 600 attack waves at Israel since joining the conflict on March 2nd. If Hezbollah begins deploying cluster warheads on its rocket inventory, the defensive burden multiplies again. Here is the full picture of where things stand. Confirmed. Iran is deploying cluster munition warheads on approximately 50% of ballistic missiles fired at Israel. The Khorramshahr 4 system can release up to 80 submunitions per missile. Israeli air defenses can intercept many, but not all bomblets. At least 18 Israeli civilians and one foreign worker have been killed by cluster munitions since the war began. Not yet confirmed, the total number of Khorramshahr, 4 missiles remaining in Iran's inventory, the production rate for cluster warheads under current conditions, whether Iran will expand deployment to 100% of launches. The professional consensus among missile defense analysts is that cluster munitions represent a category of threat that existing interception systems were not optimized to handle at scale, and that extended conflict will require either doctrinal adjustments, increased interceptor production, or acceptance of higher impact rates. Subscribe to Pivot Analysis and turn on notifications. This channel exists to examine the weapon systems, the tactical data, and the operational decisions that official communications tend to gloss over. When the next strike occurs, when the next system is deployed, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, analysis second. Always. Leave one question in the comments. Can current missile defense architectures keep pace with adversaries deploying submunition warheads at scale, or does this represent a fundamental challenge that requires new defensive technologies?